All right. Thank you, Celine, again for the invite. It's always awesome to be here with all of our feisty friends. So thank you for having me. So today we're going to talk about the stress response and the and hormones that are associated with that, managing it, how it impacts us. It's a big topic. I could talk for a half a day on this. So what I'm going to try to do is just boil it down into the stuff that's really relevant for us as, you know, elite athletes, recreational athletes, as we all are. So the body's response to stress is a highly evolutionarily conserved drive to survive. Okay, I'm being dramatic about it because it is dramatic. This is what keeps us alive. The only other physiological process that is equally powerful is the drive to reproduce. Okay, so by evolutionarily conserved, what that means is that the same mechanisms that drive the stress response in humans are the same ones that drive the stress response in the animal kingdom. And when something is conserved through many species, that means it's really freaking important. And staying alive is really freaking important, and so is reproducing. So the reason I bring that up is because when you have something so powerful, that makes it very difficult to manage it and very difficult to fight it off. Because when you think about it, if you are faced with a life-threatening situation, something else just takes over, okay? A dramatic example would be someone is in a car crash and they're what we call brain dead, okay? It's when the brain's no longer working, but they're still alive because the brain stem is still alive. That's your instinctual center, and that is a key part of the stress response. It's one of the components. So the point is that even when our brains are not working, this stress response takes over and does things to keep us alive that we have no control over and are not aware of. So it's a powerful, powerful response. So there's lots of different kinds of stress. So let's first talk about, let's define stress. So one thing is the life-threatening situation that I just mentioned, right? Another form of stress is a physical task. You know, maybe this is a race, it's an event, it's a soul-crushing CrossFit workout. It could be a specific situation, like you have a big work presentation. For me, it was my 6-hour oral medical board certification exam. I still have flashbacks about this. I think the encounter with the grizzly bear probably would have been happier than being in front of board examiners for 6 hours. So, you know, whatever situation is stressful for you. And then it could be an ongoing situation. And we're going to really take a deep dive into this. This is chronic stress. This is like family stress, dealing with aging parents, stressful job, relationship stress, overtraining, sleep deprivation, chronic energy deficit. These are longer term stressors that activate the system over the long term. And that is when we start running into health issues. So those are the different types of stress. Now, the stress response pretty much is similar for all those situations, but it's a little different. So what first happens is the brain perceives a stress. So your brain is looking at the environment. It's either, you know, encountering the dangerous situation, or you know you've got this presentation, or, you know, the marathon starting line is right there. Your brain perceives that, sends responses to the brain stem, your instinctual center, and then this hormonal cascade happens, and that is the stress response. And there are different branches of the stress response, all of which get activated in their own ways when you're encountering, we'll call it a threat, a stressor. One is the sympathetic nervous system. We hear, you know, in Next Level, we hear it in other places that Stacey Sims talks about, is the sympathetic nervous system. It's your fight or flight response, okay? And what that is, that involves the brain stem, and the adrenal glands, and other parts of the nervous system as well. And the adrenal glands are like the epicenter of your hormone response. This is where cortisol is produced. This is where epinephrine and norepinephrine are produced as well. And when that system gets activated, these hormones impact different parts of the body. They impact your vasculature. They shunt blood away from things that are not necessary to your muscles in your brain. So your digestive system is one example. So these hormones cause the vascular system to shunt blood away from the digestive system and go to the muscles where it's needed the most. Pain, the response to pain is completely overhauled. So the opioid system within our bodies, we make opioids. This isn't just something that you buy on the street. We make them in our body, and it is the way we manage pain. So that gets upregulated in anticipation of something painful happening. The immune system gets upregulated, and the immune system gets upregulated to be on the front lines of tissue repair. So if you're encountering a stressor, there's an anticipation of pain, there's an anticipation of tissue damage because you have to deal with the threat. And so the immune system gets ramped up to be ready for tissue repair and to, fight off any other threats. Now there's this other piece. It's a little bit of an offshoot of the sympathetic nervous system. It's called the hypothalamic, it's the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that just tells you what anatomical structures are involved. So the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, like I mentioned, and the hypothalamus gets involved. It communicates with the pituitary gland that secretes a whole other boatload of hormones that also will target the adrenal glands to produce cortisol, testosterone, etc. Now, there's another really interesting piece of the stress response that doesn't get activated, or gets activated only in the short term, but gets suppressed, and that's the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. That's what makes us have our periods. That's our reproductive axis. And so what the body very effectively does, especially for long-term stressors, is it dials down reproduction. Because when you think about it, if it's hunting season, say we're in the animal kingdom, it's not a good idea to be reproducing when the coyote is there waiting to eat you, okay? So what happens is during stressful times of prey in the animal kingdom, they will not be able to reproduce. We see this in humans as well. As a fertility doctor, I deal with the interaction of stress and the downregulation of the hypothalamic gonadal axis all the time. And it's profound, and it's very, very hard, even with all of my hormonal manipulations and tools in the toolbox, to overcome it. And many times I can't. I have to wait till the patient gives up, goes off to Ireland, and then she gets pregnant by herself, despite the fact I did 5 IVF cycles and I wasn't successful. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the power behind these hormonal responses. So in an acute response, meaning a short-term response, where you have that race, or you have that, that encounter with the grizzly bear, the response gets upregulated and then it shuts off, goes back to normal. And funny, the immune system is actually part of the system that helps turn it off, okay? And so the key is that when you have a short-term stress, the system returns to baseline, tissue repair happens, we recover, and we're ready and waiting for the next stressor. With chronic stress, the things I mentioned before, overtraining, energy deficit, family stress, etc., the system never dials back. You've got this low level stimulation of the adrenal glands, kicking out cortisol, kicking up epinephrine, and the immune system is activated. It's going, 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 and that's creating this inflammatory situation that isn't turning off. And so when you are subjected to this long-term activation of these hormones, that's when you run into health issues. And we know that persistently elevated cortisol levels, which is a marker of all of this stuff, it correlates with blood sugar problems, aging, chronic inflammation, and bone loss, lots of other major health issues. And that's why people look at it, is because of that correlation between elevated cortisol and problems down the road. So that is a little bit about the response, the types of stressors that are out there. Now, how does menopause fit into this? So midlife women are more sensitive to the effects of cortisol. I love the way this is described by Stacy Sims as being our hormones during reproductive life are a buffer for the effects of cortisol. I think that's so well put. And when we are perimenopausal, menopausal, those hormones start to go away, they start to decline and change, and we no longer have that buffer. So it's, you know, it's kind of like bone on bone. It's kind of like that skin knee. It's like, oh, that cortisol effect is just a little more intense in this stage of life. So we're more sensitive to the cortisol effects. On top of it, we're experiencing more stressors. So we might not be sleeping well. We might be depressed. We might be anxious. We might be having marital strain because our sex life is starting to fall apart. Maybe we have aging parents. Maybe our careers, you know, we're established in our careers. You know, this time of life just comes with more stressors. And on top of it, we are more sensitive to the cortisol. And so that's why it impacts us differently. And then when you put on top of it that we are athletes, that adds another layer onto the menopause situation, because what do we do in response to stress? We go train. And if you train too much, that is going to add another chronic stressor onto already chronic stressors. So this is where we in particular as older athletes need to pay attention and be even more mindful of that stress response, because we have multiple layers of it, more so than people who are not athletes dealing with, you know, just the stresses of menopause. So I'm just looking at my notes here. So some solutions. What do we do for solutions? Well, just like the process is complicated, the solutions are complicated too. I think the one thing that is deceiving is when we go by serum cortisol levels. Serum cortisol, that's the blood test or even the salivary tests, are notoriously inaccurate. Really, the only accurate way to get a sense of what your cortisol is a 24-hour urinary cortisol, and that's not very practical to do. They do it in studies. The study that I reviewed in my blog, that was a pretty good study, which was really cool because what it did was it did the 24-hour urinary cortisol levels at the beginning of the study and then at the end. And what they were correlating the levels with was the menopausal experience. And there are these instruments that can quantify the level of stress resulting from menopausal symptoms. And what they were able to show in the study was that if you can effectively manage those particular stressors, you actually can drive your cortisol levels down. So that paper was just a demonstration that it really matters when you deal with these symptoms. You know, when the doctors kind of just brush you off and say, okay, go deal with it, that's not productive because, you know, it doesn't help the stress. It creates more stress, in fact. And you know, it's not going to help you with your general health. So we do have evidence that managing menopausal symptoms reduces cortisol levels, reduces stress levels. But what about other stuff? You know, other stuff that we can't quantify. Like I said, the blood cortisol levels and the salivary cortisol levels are not great measures. So what do? I think the wearable technology is getting better and better. I think Whoop does a pretty good job with this, and many others too. I'm more familiar with Whoop than I am with other of the wearables. I don't have one myself, but I do work with Whoop on some stuff. But getting a sense of what the wearables are telling you about your physiology, I think could possibly be an even better indicator than cortisol itself. So finding a way to monitor your own stress response is important. And so if you have access to 24-hour urinary cortisol, great. Most people don't. The wearables, excellent. But the other thing is just, how do you feel? You know, as a physician, 90% of my evaluation of a patient is based on what she tells me. A small percentage is based on laboratory tests that I'm basically doing to exclude chronic disease. So how you feel, wearable technology are probably the two big things that we can monitor that can help us to manage our stress response. And, from an athletic standpoint, in terms of overtraining, I think the various publications by Stacy go into some great strategies for managing training volume, energy balance with good nutrition, tissue care. I can't stress tissue care enough, and things like that. So that's just in a nutshell some of the things that we can do. It's certainly not simple. There's certainly more to it. I like acupuncture. Acupuncture is great for my fertility patients. I know we don't talk about it much in the menopausal world because the studies in the menopause world look at acupuncture and hot flashes. There isn't really much study on acupuncture in stress because stress is so hard to quantify. So I would even throw acupuncture in there if you enjoy it. If you're needle phobic, don't do it. Then that's going to be more stressful. That would be bad. So that's another tool: massage, body work, various things like that. So that's about all I got. I'm happy to take questions.
Let me throw a couple before we open it all up. Let me throw a couple your way that I was thinking while you were talking. You talk about exercise and stress, and I've written about this a million times in my writing for Bicycling and Runner's World and Men's Health and, all of those magazines over the years. And, there seems to be an interplay where, it is good for reducing cortisol sort of long-term to be regularly active, but also, as you're pointing, like when they look at triathletes, especially like Ironman triathletes, hair samples, they can see elevated cortisol in actually their hair samples. But I've also talked to neuroscientists who are like, well, yes, but high intensity exercise makes you more stress resistant. So it takes more stress to get that same stress response, and that trickles into life. So do you have any thoughts on like the sweet spot there as far as our exercise and stress is concerned?
I think that's a great point. I think when you refer to the exercise, the stress resistance, that's probably what I think he or she might be saying, is that the exercise is chronically elevating those cortisol levels so that the body can't respond quite as effectively because it never quite ever returns to normal. But I don't think that's true of everybody. I mean, I think that might be somebody who's overtraining. I think, the assumption by a lot of physicians who don't really know athletes is that, well, if you're training for triathlon, you must chronically be overtraining.
Yeah, no, and not to step on you there. She was actually saying that it's a good thing because your body adapts to it in a way where it doesn't overreact to daily stress as much as it might.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah,
I get it.
So
in terms of the sweet spot, I think what one has to do is really take an inventory of all their stressors. You have to really sit down and say, all right, what is my situation? Do I still like okay, I still like my husband. Maybe that's not a stress. The kids, the job, and the training. I think you have to, what are my hot flashes like? Am I experiencing anxiety? All of these things. If you take an inventory and try to say, okay, I got to deal with this, this, and this, and this, and then just chip away at it. I think you can lower that stress response just by dealing with all the other stuff too. And then it may fall in line if you can effectively deal with all the stressors that are going on in your life.